While I was sitting in Dr. Ferris's waiting room, waiting to hear whether the mass in my left lung was malignant, my son Richard was at Perry's on Walnut Street, laughing over a glass of Macallan with two men in expensive jackets, running a company the Philadelphia business journals had just valued at $12 million. I know this because I could hear the ambient noise of the restaurant when he picked up the clink of glassware, the low hum of money at lunch. He listened to me say the word tumor. He listened to me say $3,500. Then he said 5 words and hung up. "You're on your own, Dad." He had no idea I'd already met with my attorney 3 times, or what documents were already filed with the court. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the time because I'd been staring at the clock above the reception desk for 40 minutes, waiting for the nurse to call my name. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old carpet. There were 6 other people in the chairs around me. None of them looked up when I dialed. I'd rehearsed the conversation in the car, not because I expected much. I'd stopped expecting much from Richard around the time he stopped calling me anything other than Dad in a tone that made the word sound like a complaint. But I rehearsed it anyway. The way you check a door lock you already know is broken. The hospital bill was $3,500, not $35,000, not $350,000, $3,500 for a procedure that Dr. Ferris had told me, in the same calm voice he probably used for everything, could not wait past the end of the month. Richard answered on the 4th ring. I could hear the ambient noise of Perry's in the background, that low hum of expensive conversation, the clink of glassware. He was having lunch. I pictured the Macallan on the table without even trying. I told him about the tumor. I told him about the surgery date. I told him the number $3,500. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone thinking, the quiet of someone deciding how little they needed to say. Then he said it, "You're on your own, Dad." And the line went dead. I sat with the phone in my lap for a moment. The woman across from me was reading a magazine. The man to my left was watching something on his phone with one earbud in. Nobody had heard a word. I folded the hospital bill along its original crease and put it back in my jacket pocket. I thought about the morning 3 weeks earlier when Catherine had been on the phone with Richard for 45 minutes. I'd been at the kitchen table, eating toast, listening to her voice carry through the thin wall of our row house in northeast Philadelphia. She wasn't talking to him about me. She was talking about him about the profile piece some Philadelphia business journal had run, about his company, about the number 12 million, which she said twice in a voice I recognized as the voice she used for things she wanted me to hear. When she came back into the kitchen, she didn't look at me. She picked up her coffee cup, looked at the electric bill on the counter, and said, "That needs to be dealt with." Then she left the room. I sat there for a moment. The toast had gone cold. I drank my coffee anyway. There was another piece of paper on the kitchen table that morning, under the edge of my coffee cup. A letter from Marcus Webb, dated the day before. I'd read it twice already. I didn't need to read it again. Back in the waiting room, I put my phone in my pocket and looked at the clock. 2:51 p.m. The nurse hadn't called my name yet. I had 4 minutes, maybe 5. I dialed Sarah. She picked up on the 2nd ring. She was at school. I could hear the distant sound of a hallway between classes, lockers, voices. I told her I'd spoken to Richard. I didn't tell her what he'd said. I didn't need to. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. And then she said, "I'll figure something out. Dad, don't worry about it." Not a question, not a hesitation. She said it the way you say something you've already decided. "You don't have to." I started. "I'll call you tonight," she said, and she hung up. The nurse appeared at the door with a clipboard and called my name. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked across the waiting room. The hospital bill was still in my pocket. The letter from Marcus Webb was at home on the kitchen table, under the edge of my coffee cup, right where I'd left it. Richard had $12 million and 5 words for me. I had something else entirely. Back in the waiting room, I put my phone in my pocket and looked at the clock. 2:51 p.m. The nurse hadn't called my name yet. I had spent 11 years saving for 60 acres in Chester County, working double shifts, eating lunch at my desk, skipping every vacation from the time I was 27 until the time I was 38. The plan was straightforward: rezone the land, bring in utilities, sell parcels to residential developers pushing west out of the city. My development partner, Gerald Hauk, had done it twice before. Then a routine soil test in the spring of 2014 found petroleum hydrocarbon contamination from underground fuel tanks that had been leaking since the 1990s. The remediation estimate was $2.1 million. The bank called the note within 90 days. By October, Catherine and I were in a 2-bedroom apartment in Lansdowne, and I was operating a forklift at a distribution warehouse in southwest Philadelphia. I was 48 years old. Richard was 22 that fall. He had been planning a trip to Destin with his college friends, a week in Florida I had promised to cover back in March. When I still had 60 acres and a reason to believe I could afford it, I sat him down at the kitchen table in the Lansdowne apartment and told him exactly what had happened. I told him I was sorry. He looked at me for a long moment, said, "You ruined everything," in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, pushed back his chair, and walked to his room. He was gone before I woke up the next morning. He went to Destin anyway. Sarah was 16. One evening in November, about 3 weeks after the bank finalized the house, I was sitting at that kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I wasn't doing anything. Sarah came out of her room, sat down across from me without being asked, and said, "Dad, we'll be okay." Not a comfort, not a performance, just a fact stated by a 16-year-old girl who had decided it was true. Then she got up and went back to her room. I had thought about that sentence many times in the years since. The debt took 7 years to clear. I worked 6 days a week and drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked rear bumper and did not take a vacation for 5 years. But that sentence was the only true thing anyone said to me that entire fall. I had bought it in 3 separate parcels over 4 years, working with a development partner named Gerald Hauk, who had built strip malls and small commercial lots across southeastern Pennsylvania. The plan was straightforward: rezone the land, bring in utilities, sell parcels to residential developers who were pushing west out of the city. Gerald had done it twice before. I had spent 11 years saving for it, not saving the way people talk about saving, but working double shifts, skipping vacations, eating lunch at my desk every day for 11 years. The 60 acres represented everything I had built since I was 27 years old. The contamination showed up in a routine soil test in the spring of 2014. The previous owner had leased the back portion of the land to a fuel storage company in the 1990s, and 2 underground tanks had been leaking for years. The technical term was petroleum hydrocarbon contamination. The practical term was that no residential developer in the state would touch the land. The remediation estimate came in at $2.1 million, and the bank called the note within 90 days. Gerald dissolved the partnership by certified mail. I signed the papers at a folding table in a conference room that smelled like burnt plastic, and I drove home on I-76 with the windows down because I needed the air. I lost everything in 6 months. The house in Chestnut Hill went to the bank in August. By October, Catherine and I were renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Lansdowne, and I had taken a job operating a forklift at a distribution warehouse in southwest Philadelphia. I was 48 years old. Richard was 22 that fall, finishing his last year at Temple. He had been planning a trip to Destin with 4 of his college friends, a week in Florida, a rented house on the beach. The kind of trip that costs $5,000 when you add up flights and the house and food and whatever else 22-year-olds spend money on in Florida. I had told him the previous spring that I would cover it. I had told him that in March, when I still had 60 acres and a development timeline and a reason to believe I could afford it. By September, I could not afford it. I told him on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table in the Lansdowne apartment. I told him exactly what had happened: the contamination, the remediation estimate, the bank, the timeline. I told him I was sorry. I told him I would make it right when I could. He looked at me across that table for a long moment. Then he said, "You ruined everything." Not loudly. He said it the way you state a fact. He pushed back his chair, stood up, and walked to his room. He did not come to dinner that night. He was gone before I woke up the next morning. He went to Destin anyway. I never asked how. I assumed Catherine helped him, or he borrowed from a friend. He came back with a tan and didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. And then he graduated in December, moved into an apartment with 2 roommates in Center City, and began the process of becoming someone who had no father. Sarah was 16 that fall. She was a sophomore at Lansdowne Alden, and she had a part-time job at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the apartment. And she did not, as far as I could tell, spend a single day grieving what we had lost. I watched her for signs of it, the withdrawn silences, the resentment, the way kids sometimes turn the failures of their parents into a permanent verdict. I watched, and I didn't see it. What I saw instead was that she reorganized her bedroom the first week in the apartment, put up her posters, and within 10 days knew the names of both neighbors in the hallway. One evening in November, about 3 weeks after the bank finalized the house, I was sitting at that kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I wasn't doing anything. I was just sitting there. Sarah came out of her room, looked at me, and sat down across from me without being asked. She said, "Dad, we'll be okay." She said it without hesitation, without the performance of cheerfulness, without trying to convince either of us of anything. She just said it, and then she got up and went back to her room. I sat there for another 10 minutes. I drank the cold coffee. I went to bed. I have thought about that sentence many times in the years since, not because it solved anything. It didn't. The debt took 7 years to clear. I worked 6 days a week at the warehouse and picked up weekend shifts when they were available. And I ate lunch from a vending machine and drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked rear bumper, and I did not take a vacation for 5 years. The 60 acres sat in receivership and eventually sold for remediation value, which meant I saw none of it. I thought about that sentence because it was the only true thing anyone said to me that entire fall. Not a promise, not a comfort, just a fact stated by a 16-year-old girl who had decided it was true. Richard did not call on my birthday that year. He did not call the year after either. By the time he was 26, he had a Series 7 license and a job at a financial firm in Center City. By 29, he was running a division. By 32, he had $12 million in a house in Villanova with a 3-car garage. And I knew these things not because he told me, but because Catherine told me, with the particular pride of someone who has decided that one child's success retroactively justifies every difficult year. She said his name the way people say the names of places they wish they lived. He never called. Not once in 10 years did Richard Calloway call his father to ask how the debt was going, or whether the back held up on the warehouse floor, or whether I had eaten that day. Last Tuesday morning, I sat at my kitchen table in Lansdowne, the same table, a different apartment, the same city, with a cup of coffee and a letter from Marcus Webb, Esquire, tucked under the edge of the mug where I'd left it the night before. I had read it twice already. I didn't need to read it a third time. I knew what it said. I thought about Richard at 22, pushing back from that table. I thought about Sarah at 16, not pushing back from anything. I thought about 60 acres in Chester County and a soil test and 6 months that took 11 years to rebuild from. I was not going to call Richard and ask again. I was not going to explain myself to Catherine. I was not going to sit at this table and wait for something to happen to me. I finished the coffee. I set the mug down exactly over the letter, covering Marcus Webb's return address in the upper left corner. Then I picked up my phone and made a call. I didn't tell anyone what I said on that call. Dr. Ferris had his office on the 4th floor of Jefferson Hospital, a corner room that looked out over Walnut Street. He was a careful man, the kind who measured his words the way a contractor measures a foundation before pouring concrete. He had been my pulmonologist for 3 years, since a routine chest x-ray at a company physical had flagged something small and uncertain in my left lobe. For 3 years, small and uncertain had stayed small and uncertain. In October, it stopped being either. He set the imaging on the light board himself, rather than letting the resident do it. He pointed to the shadow near the bronchial wall with the cap of his pen, not the tip. I noticed that. He said the word malignant once, then paused to let me catch up. I told him I'd caught up. He said we were looking at a resection surgical removal of the affected tissue, and that the procedure itself was straightforward given the location and the current staging. He said current staging, the way people say, for now. I heard that too. The surgery was scheduled for the second week of November. The out-of-pocket cost after my insurance, a plan I carried through the forklift company, which covered hospitalizations but had a gap in surgical specialist fees, was $3,500. Dr. Ferris didn't tell me that number. He referred me to the billing office on the second floor, where a woman named Becky, who had a laminated ID badge and a Philadelphia Eagles mug that had been washed so many times the logo had faded to a suggestion, walked me through the itemized sheet without flinching. 15 years in hospital billing. She had delivered this kind of news before. $3,500, Mr. Calloway, she said, due 10 business days before the procedure date. I thanked her. I folded the sheet along its original crease and put it in my jacket pocket. I took the elevator down and walked to my truck in the parking garage on Chestnut Street, and I sat there for 4 minutes before I started the engine. Perry's restaurant on Sansom Street had a bar along the left wall and a dining room in the back with low lighting and leather booths. Richard ate there twice a month. I knew this because his assistant, a young woman named Dana, who had once called me by mistake looking for Richard's dry cleaning, had mentioned it during the 30 seconds before she realized her error. People tell you things when they're not paying attention. Richard was at the bar when I arrived, not the dining room. He was with 2 men in jackets I didn't recognize, the kind of jackets that cost more than my monthly truck payment. He had a glass of Macallan in front of him, amber and neat, and he was laughing at something one of the men had said. He saw me come in. The laugh didn't stop immediately. It finished on its own schedule. He excused himself from the 2 men and met me near the hostess stand. He didn't offer to move to a table. The bartender, a younger man whose name tag said James, was close enough to hear everything without appearing to listen. I've worked enough job sites to know the difference between a man who's tuned out and a man who's paying attention. James was paying attention. I told Richard about Dr. Ferris. I told him about the resection, the timeline, the $3,500. I kept it short. He had the same expression he'd had at 22 when I told him about the Chester County investment, not angry, not moved, just waiting for me to finish. He said, "Dad, I can't help you. I have my own life." I looked at him. He picked up his Macallan and turned it slightly in his hand. I said, "Understood." I walked out. Behind me, I heard him say something to the 2 men, something with a short laugh attached to it. I didn't turn around. James was wiping down the bar with a cloth. He didn't look up, but he also didn't keep wiping. He just held the cloth still for a moment. I noticed that too. I called Marcus Webb from the truck. He picked up on the second ring. "Marcus," I said, "I need you to prepare the documents. Today." He said, "I'll have Patricia meet us at 4. That was all. I drove to South Philly, to a diner on Passyunk Avenue where the booths are red vinyl and they still bring coffee without being asked. Sarah was already there when I arrived. She had driven from her apartment in Germantown, 25 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, and she was sitting in the back booth with her coat still on and her hands wrapped around a mug. I sat down across from her. I told her the same things I'd told Richard: the diagnosis, the surgery date, the $3,500. I said it the same way I'd said it to him. Same words, same order. She didn't ask me to repeat anything. She didn't look away. She said, "I have the Honda. I've been thinking about selling it anyway. The transmission's been making a noise." She said it the way you say something that's already been decided. "Dad, you can't put a price on a parent." I looked at my coffee. There was a small chip on the rim of the mug, old and smooth. Someone had been drinking from that chip for years without cutting themselves. I told her she didn't have to do that. She said she knew. The distinction mattered to her, and I understood why. Marcus Webb's office was on Chestnut Street, 3 blocks from Jefferson Hospital. He had been a contracts and estate attorney for 27 years, and his office looked exactly like what it was: a room where careful men made careful decisions. He was at his desk when I arrived at 4 o'clock. Patricia Chen, who had been a notary for 31 years and processed more estate documents than she could count, was already seated in the chair beside his desk with a folder open in her lap. Marcus looked up when I came in. He said, "I found what you described. All of it." He set a folder on the desk and pushed it toward me without opening it. "This document will change everything." I didn't open it either. I already knew what was in it. I had known for 8 months since the morning I'd gone through the files in the storage unit on Aramingo Avenue and found the thing I'd been half expecting to find and half hoping I wouldn't. I sat down. Patricia capped her pen and set it on the folder in her lap without being asked. The room was quiet except for the sound of traffic on Chestnut Street, 4 floors below. I said, "Let's begin." Perry's was on Walnut Street, the kind of place where the tablecloths were pressed and the menus had no prices on the customer's side. I had driven past it a dozen times in the past 2 years without stopping. I stopped that Tuesday. The hostess, a young woman who looked like she'd been trained to smile at everyone, equally seated me at a table near the window. I told her I was meeting someone. She said, "Of course, sir." I ordered water and waited. Richard arrived 7 minutes late with a man I recognized from the business section of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Harrison Price, director of Price Capital Management. They were laughing about something when they came through the door, and Richard's laugh stopped when he saw me sitting at the table. He recovered quickly. He always did. He shook Harrison's arm and said something low, and Harrison nodded, and they both walked over. Richard said, "Dad, I didn't know you were coming here." His voice was pleasant. That was the part I would remember most. Later, how pleasant his voice was. I said, "I called. You didn't pick up." I stood and shook Harrison's hand. Harrison was polite. He had the handshake of a man who shook hands for a living. We sat. A server came, a young man, maybe 30, with dark hair and the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing the same job long enough to stop thinking about it. His name tag said James. He had been at Perry's for 8 years. I didn't know that yet. Richard ordered sparkling water and looked at his phone once before putting it away. Harrison excused himself to take a call. That left Richard and me. I told Richard about Dr. Ferris. I told him about the mass in the lower lobe of my left lung, about the surgery date, about the $3,500 that I did not have because the forklift job at the Kensington warehouse paid $19.40 an hour, and most of that went to the apartment on Frankfurt Avenue. I told him the number clearly, once. Richard listened with his hands folded on the table. When I finished, he said, "Dad, you smoked for 22 years. I said, "I know." He said, "You made bad investments. You lost everything, and we all had to live with that. And now you want me to—" He stopped. He looked at Harrison's empty chair, then back at me. He said, "You brought this on yourself." James had come back to refill the water glasses. He stopped 2 feet from the table. Richard said, "I run a company. I have responsibilities. I can't carry dead weight." He said it the way you'd say something about the weather. Flat. Certain. He picked up his menu. "You're on your own." "Dad." The table was very quiet. James stood where he had stopped, the water pitcher in his hand, and he looked at Richard. Then he looked at me. The expression on his face was not the face of a man who was pretending not to have heard. It was the face of a man who had heard every word and wished he hadn't. I thanked Richard for his time. I stood, put my jacket on, and walked out through the front door onto Walnut Street. The afternoon was cold and bright. I drove home on I-95 with the radio off. That evening, James wrote down the date, the time, the table number, and what he had heard. He did this on a notepad he kept in his locker. He told me later that he had done it because something about it felt wrong enough to document. He had worked at Perry's for 8 years and had never done that before. I called Marcus from the kitchen at 9 that night. I said, "He said it in front of a witness." Marcus said, "Tell me." I told him. When I finished, Marcus said, "Good. We'll need that. Keep his name." I wrote James's name on the notepad by the phone. Then I made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at the light coming through the window over the sink. It was the same light that had come through that window for 11 years. I had counted the panes once, a long time ago. There were 4. I drank the coffee and went to bed. Catherine was in the kitchen when I got home, standing at the stove with her back to me. I told her what Dr. Ferris had found. I told her about the $3,500. She didn't turn around. She said, "Don't do this to Richard. He's worked too hard for you to make him look bad." Then, after a moment, ask Emma if she can help with something. I said, "Sarah. Her name is Sarah." Catherine said, "Whatever, Sarah. Emma, she's not the point. Richard is my son. You don't get to embarrass him with this." She went back to stirring. I went to the back bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. 20 minutes later, I heard her on the phone in the hallway. She didn't lower her voice. She said, "Your father is trying to manipulate you with this cancer thing. Don't fall for it. You have a future to protect." I sat there and listened to the whole thing. The next morning, Carol Dempsey called me. She lives next door, 22 years next door. She said, "David, I heard what your wife said on the phone last night. My window was open. I'm sorry, that's not right." I thanked her. I didn't say anything else. After I hung up, I sat for a moment, then called Marcus. I said, "My wife just put herself on the record. She called our daughter Emma instead of Sarah. Then she told Richard the cancer was manipulation and that he had a future to protect." Marcus was quiet for a second. Then he said, "She'll regret that." I wrote Carol's name on the notepad below James's. Sarah called me on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the dinner at Carmine's. I was at work, on the dock at the Frankfurt Distribution Center, waiting on a pallet of residential fixtures that had been logged wrong in the system. My phone buzzed in my vest pocket. I stepped away from the forklift and answered. She said, "Dad, I need to tell you something. I sold the car." I didn't say anything right away. "The Civic," she said. "I sold it yesterday. I got $2,000. It's not enough for the full surgery cost, but I talked to the billing office at Jefferson and they said they can work with a partial payment up front. I also," she paused, "I took out a payday loan, $1,500. I know that's not ideal, but the rate is manageable if I pay it back within the cycle." She said all of this the way you say something you've already decided, not asking, not waiting for permission. I said, "Sarah." She said, "Dad, a car can be replaced. You can't." I was standing between a loading dock and a concrete pillar with the smell of diesel and cold morning air coming off the river. I had worked this dock for 4 years. Before that, I had worked in a different building, doing different work. And before that, I had been the kind of man who owned the buildings. I had stood in boardrooms and signed papers for properties worth more than most people see in 3 lifetimes. I had lost all of it. I had rebuilt nothing except the habit of showing up and the understanding that showing up was enough. And my 26-year-old daughter had sold her car. I pressed my thumb against the edge of my phone and said, "You shouldn't have to do this. Sarah." She said, "I know, but I'm doing it anyway." I didn't say anything for a moment. There was a forklift moving somewhere behind me, the low mechanical groan of a load being shifted. I counted 4 seconds before I trusted my voice again. I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." I said, "I'll call Dr. Ferris's office this morning and confirm the date." She exhaled, not dramatically, just the way a person exhales when they've been holding something they didn't realize they were holding. She said, "Good, I'll come with you." I told her she didn't have to. She said she was going to anyway. After we hung up, I stood there for another minute before I went back to the forklift. The pallet of fixtures was still logged wrong and someone was going to have to reconcile it before the afternoon shift. I did my job. I moved the load. I reconciled the log. I did not call Richard. I did not call Catherine. I thought about the notepad in my kitchen drawer with James's name on it and Carol Dempsey's name below it and the folder Marcus Webb had been building for 11 weeks. And I thought not yet. Not quite yet. The surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Dr. Ferris's office confirmed the date when I called at 11:30 that morning. The woman at the billing desk, her name was Renata, and she had the particular patience of someone who has had this same conversation more times than she can count, walked me through the payment arrangement. $2,000 up front, the remainder structured over 6 months. She said, "We'll make this work, Mr. Calloway." I thanked her and meant it. Sarah drove me to Jefferson on the morning of the surgery. She had taken a personal day from school. She sat with me in pre-op while I changed into the gown, and she didn't make it into more than it was. She didn't cry. She sat in the chair by the window with a paperback she wasn't really reading and occasionally looked up and said something ordinary about traffic on Broad Street, about a student in her third period class who had recently discovered he liked geometry. She was giving me something to listen to that wasn't the sound of the hospital. I understood that. I let her give it. Dr. Ferris came in at 6:45. He shook my hand and said, "You ready?" I said I was. He said, "Good. We're going to take care of this." He said it the way a man says something he has said before and still means. I appreciated that. They took me back at 7. I woke up in recovery at 11:20. The first thing I registered was the ceiling white acoustic tile, the same as every ceiling in every hospital I'd ever been in, which was not many until this year. The second thing was a nurse named Gerald who was adjusting something on the IV line and told me without being asked that the procedure had gone well. He said, "Dr. Ferris will be in shortly." Dr. Ferris came in at 11:50. He said, "We got it. Clean margins. The mass is out." He said my lung function was good and that recovery would take time, but the prognosis was solid. He said, "You did the right thing, not waiting." I thought about the 8 days between the diagnosis and the dinner at Carmine's. I thought about the 4 days after that before I called Marcus. I thought about the fact that I had not waited, not because Richard had helped me, but because Sarah had sold her car and taken out a payday loan at 26 years old on a teacher's salary in Philadelphia. I said, "Thank you, Dr. Ferris." He nodded and left. Sarah came in a few minutes later. She sat in the same chair she'd been in before, and she looked at me for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Dr. Ferris told me it went well." I said, "He told me the same." She reached over and put her hand on mine. She didn't say anything else. Neither did I. There was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already in the room. That evening, around 8 o'clock, I looked at my phone. There were no missed calls from Richard, no messages from Catherine. I had not expected any. I noted the absence the same way I noted everything now quietly, without surprise, as a fact to be recorded. At 8:47, a message came through from Marcus Webb. It said, "Documents are ready. Richard's lawyer will be contacted tomorrow." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the blanket and looked at the ceiling again. The same white acoustic tile. 14 panels from where I was lying to the window. I had been counting things for a long time. Ceiling tiles, names on a notepad, weeks since a diagnosis, days since a son said no. I had been counting because counting is a way of staying precise when everything around you is trying to make you imprecise, trying to make you react instead of think, grieve instead of prepare, beg instead of wait. I had not begged, I had not reacted, I had waited, and I had prepared, and now the documents were ready. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of pain, though there was some. I lay in the hospital bed and thought about a property I had owned on Germantown Avenue in 2003, a mixed-use building I had bought for $400,000 and sold 2 years later for $610,000. I thought about the morning I signed the sale papers, the way the pen had felt in my hand, the particular satisfaction of a thing completed. I had not felt that satisfaction in a long time. I thought I might feel it again soon. At 9:15 the following morning, Marcus Webb called Richard. I know what was said because Marcus told me afterward, word for word, the way Marcus tells me everything plainly, without interpretation, leaving the weight of it to me. Marcus said, "Mr. Calloway, I'm calling on behalf of my client, David. We are filing a lawsuit regarding the misappropriation of family assets and violation of fiduciary duty. You will be served tomorrow." Richard was silent. Marcus said, "Do you understand?" Richard said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Marcus said, "You will." Then Marcus ended the call. When he told me this, I was still in the hospital bed, one day post-surgery, with Sarah asleep in the recliner by the window. I listened to the whole account without interrupting. When Marcus finished, I said, "Thank you." Marcus said, "Get some rest. We'll talk Thursday." I set the phone down again. Sarah stirred in the recliner. She opened her eyes, looked at me, and said, "Everything okay?" I said, "Yes." She closed her eyes again. Outside the window, Philadelphia was doing what Philadelphia does in late October gray sky, yellow leaves on the sidewalk, the particular light of a city that has been here long enough not to be surprised by anything. I had grown up 40 minutes from this city. I had built things in it and lost things in it and driven its streets for 58 years. I was still here. I looked at the ceiling one more time. 14 tiles. I knew exactly what was coming. I had built it carefully, piece by piece, over 11 weeks, while my son said no, and my wife called our daughter by the wrong name, and the world assumed I was finished. They had all made the same mistake. They had looked at a man on a forklift with a cancer diagnosis and seen a man who was out of moves. They had not looked carefully enough. The recovery room had 4 beds and smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of recycled hospital air. I became aware of the ceiling first white acoustic tile, the same kind as every other ceiling in this building, and then of the light, which was the flat, sourceless kind that makes it impossible to tell the time of day. I turned my head, and Sarah was there. She was sitting in the chair beside the bed, with her jacket still on, her arms crossed against her chest, and her eyes were closed. She had fallen asleep sitting up. There was a paper cup of coffee on the floor beside the chair, tipped slightly against her bag. It had been there long enough to go cold. I watched her for a moment. She had driven herself to this hospital at 5 in the morning to be here when I came out of surgery. She had sold her car to help pay for this surgery. She was 26 years old, and she was sleeping in a plastic chair in a recovery room because she would not go home until she knew I was awake. I said, "Thank you, sweetheart." My voice came out rougher than I expected the anesthesia or the tube they had run down my throat, or both. Her eyes opened immediately. She sat forward and looked at me, and the relief that crossed her face was the kind you cannot manufacture. She said, "You're going to be okay, Dad. That's all that matters." I told her to go home and sleep in an actual bed. She told me she would when I did. We stayed like that for a while. Sarah's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Spruce Street, a 12-minute drive from Jefferson Hospital. It was small, 1-bedroom, which she gave to me without being asked, a living room that also served as her grading space, with stacks of student papers on the coffee table and a dry erase board propped against the far wall with lesson notes she had not erased. The kitchen had 1 window that looked out onto the back of the building across the alley. The whole apartment was maybe 600 square feet. It was clean. Everything in it had been chosen carefully and on a teacher's salary, which meant nothing was wasted. There was a shelf above the radiator with 3 plants she watered every morning. There was a photograph on the wall near the door, Sarah and me, taken at the Jersey Shore the summer she was 9, both of us squinting into the sun. I did not remember who had taken it. I stood in front of it for a long moment the first morning I was well enough to stand without holding on to something. She cooked soup that evening and sat with me while I ate it. The next day, she helped me walk the length of the hallway and back, twice, at the pace a man walks when his chest has been opened and closed and he is learning to breathe again. She did not make a production of any of it. She just did it. I thought about the forklift yard on Delaware Avenue, the way the cold came off the river in the early morning, the weight of the machine under my hands. I thought about how far I had come from the man who had once signed contracts in offices not unlike Richard's. And I thought about how none of that mattered here, in this apartment, with my daughter walking beside me in the hallway, one hand near my elbow in case I needed it. On the 4th day, Sarah went back to school. She had already taken 2 days of personal leave. I sat in her living room with a cup of coffee and my phone and the particular quiet of a weekday apartment in a city where everyone else has somewhere to be. My phone buzzed at 10:47 in the morning. Marcus Webb. He said, "Richard just called a lawyer. A friend of his, Thomas Greer, does mostly corporate work, not much family law. He's asking questions he wouldn't be asking unless he was scared." I said, "What kind of questions?" Marcus said, "Fiduciary duty, what it means, what exposure looks like." He wanted to know what happens when someone says you violated it. He paused. I made sure the right people knew we'd filed. Word travels. I did not say anything for a moment. I looked at the dry erase board across the room, Sarah's lesson notes, something about primary sources and how to evaluate them. Marcus said, "We're ready to move forward. The hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Judge Harlan will preside." I said, "Thank you, Marcus." He said he'd send the confirmation to my email. Then the call ended. I set the phone on the cushion beside me and drank the rest of my coffee. It had gone lukewarm while we were talking. I drank it anyway. Somewhere in a glass office building on Market Street, Richard was on the phone with Thomas Greer, asking what fiduciary duty meant and what it meant when your father's lawyer used that phrase in a formal notice, and whether it was serious. I knew what Thomas Greer had told him because Marcus had told me what Thomas Greer would say. It was serious. It was the kind of serious that did not go away with a phone call or a family dinner or a check written at the last minute. Richard had spent 10 years watching me drive a forklift and deciding that was the complete picture. He had sat across from me in a restaurant and said the words dead weight with his voice perfectly level, the way you say something you have already decided is simply true. He had not asked, at any point in those 10 years, what I had been doing quietly on the side. He had not asked because he had already concluded there was nothing worth asking about. That Tuesday at 10 a.m., Judge Harlan would open a folder. Inside that folder was 11 weeks of preparation documents that Marcus had assembled with the particular thoroughness of a man who had been doing this for 23 years, and who had told me, when I first called him from the hospital parking lot after Dr. Ferris gave me the diagnosis, that what I was describing was actionable and that I should give him everything I had. I had given him everything I had. I picked up the coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. Outside the window of Sarah's apartment, the alley was quiet. A pigeon landed on the fire escape railing and sat there for a moment, considering something, and then flew away. I was 63 years old. I had a surgical scar and a daughter who watered her plants every morning and a hearing scheduled for Tuesday at 10. I was not finished. The envelope arrived on a Saturday morning. Sarah called me at 8:47, I know, because I was in the kitchen of my own apartment by then, back on my feet and sleeping in my own bed again. And I had been watching the clock the way I had learned to watch clocks during the weeks after surgery, when time moved differently and every hour had a weight to it. She said, "Dad, there's something here from Marcus Webb." Her voice was careful, not frightened, but careful. The way she got when she was trying to understand something before she reacted to it. I told her to open it. She was quiet for a moment. I heard paper, then more paper, then nothing for a long time. "Dad?" "I know." How long have you had this?" I told her to read the whole thing first. She did. I waited. Outside my window, a delivery truck was backing up on the street, the beeping regular and mechanical. And I counted the intervals without meaning to. 7 beeps. A pause. 4 more. When she came back on the line, her voice was different, not careful anymore. Something had settled in it, the way a room settles after a door finally closes. "He took $50,000, she said. "He did. From your account, yours and Mom's." "From the joint account, yes, 3 years ago, in 2 transfers. The first was $30,000 in March. The second was $20,000 in September. I had looked at those numbers enough times that they had stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like something else, like a measurement of something I had not wanted to measure. Marcus pulled the bank records. The transfer authorization has Richard's handwriting on the request form. The bank kept a physical copy. She was quiet again. I let her be quiet. The document Marcus had prepared was 41 pages. I had read it twice at his office and once more at home, sitting at the kitchen table with the light on at 2 in the morning, and I had not found a single error. Marcus was thorough in the way that men who have been doing one thing for a very long time become thorough, not showy about it, just complete. Every transfer documented, every authorization noted. The bank's own records cross-referenced with the account statements I had kept, which I had kept not because I suspected anything at the time, but because I had spent enough years in real estate to understand that paper was the only thing that did not change its story later. The second section of the document was the recording. Pennsylvania is a two-party consent state for most purposes, but there are exceptions, and Marcus had explained them to me in the parking lot of the hospital on the day I called him, standing next to my truck with the diagnosis still new enough that I kept forgetting it and then remembering it again. He had asked me whether I had any recordings. I told him about the call with Richard, the one from the week after Dr. Ferris had given me the staging results. When I had called my son from the parking lot of the Wawa on Aramingo Avenue and asked him for $3,500, I'd recorded it on my phone. I'd not known for certain that I would ever use it, but I had recorded it. Marcus had reviewed the recording with a colleague who specialized in Pennsylvania evidentiary law. The call qualified. I had been a party to the conversation. The content was relevant to a legal matter. It was admissible. The transcript was on pages 22 through 26 of the document. I had read it so many times that I could have recited portions of it without looking, but reading it still did something to the air in whatever room I was in. It made the room feel smaller. Richard's voice in the transcript, rendered in plain black type on white paper. "I don't care if you die, I'm not helping you." 7 words. I had counted them the first time I read the transcript, and I had counted them every time since. "Dad," Sarah said. "He said that." "He did." "I don't care if you die." She said it quietly, not to me, just saying the words out loud to hear what they sounded like outside of a document. "He actually said that." "He did." She was quiet for a long moment. I heard her set something down the papers. I thought, or maybe her phone briefly against a surface. When she came back, she said, "The letter from Mr. Webb says Tuesday at 10, at the courthouse on Filbert Street." "Yes. He says I'm listed as a witness." "You are? For what?" I had thought about how to answer this question. I had thought about it for several weeks. Actually, in the way I thought about things I needed to say, carefully turning them over, looking at them from different angles, making sure I understood what I was actually saying before I said it. I had not wanted to tell Sarah more than she needed to know before she needed to know it, not to protect her from the truth, but because I had learned, in the years since the Millbrook project collapsed and I lost everything and had to start again, that the timing of information mattered, that telling someone a thing too early was sometimes the same as not telling them at all, because the context wasn't there yet to hold it. But she had read the document now. The context was there. "I suspected Richard had taken the money for a long time," I said. "I didn't have proof until Marcus found the transfer records, the recording I had from the beginning. I wanted you to know the truth before we walked into that courtroom. I didn't want you to be surprised in there." She said, "Were you ever going to tell me without the court date forcing it?" That was a fair question. I thought about it honestly. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe. I think I wanted to be sure first. I wanted to be sure it was real and not something I had built in my head because I was angry." She was quiet for a moment. "Then is it real that—" "The bank records are real," I said. "The recording is real. The handwriting on the authorization form, Marcus had it analyzed. It's Richard's. All of it is real." I heard her exhale. It was a long breath, the kind that comes out when you have been holding something without knowing you were holding it. "Okay," she said. "Tuesday at 10. I'll be there." I told her I would pick her up at 9. The weekend passed, the way weekends pass when something large is scheduled for Monday's end. I drove my route Saturday night and Sunday night, the warehouse on Delaware Avenue, the logistics center off I-95, the same route I had been running for 4 years. The forklift, the same forklift. The loading dock, the same loading dock. There was something steady in that. I had learned to find steadiness in the repetitive and the physical. It was one of the things forklift work had given me, that the real estate years never had. The real estate years had been full of meetings and projections and the particular exhaustion of managing other people's expectations. And when it collapsed completely. and I had spent a long time afterward finding out what I was when the projections were gone. What I found was that I was a man who could work a physical job without complaint, who could show up at the same time every shift, who could be counted on. That had turned out to be enough to build something on. Tuesday morning was cold. October in Philadelphia does that. It reminds you that it is October whether you are ready or not. I drove to Sarah's apartment and she was waiting outside, her coat buttoned, a folder under her arm. She had printed the document. I had not asked her to. She had done it because she was the kind of person who printed things she needed to understand, who made notes in the margins, who showed up prepared. She got into the truck and looked at me. "How are you feeling?" "Fine," I said. Good." She looked at me for another moment in the way she had been looking at me since the surgery, not worried exactly, but attentive, taking inventory. Then she looked forward and said, "Okay, let's go." The courthouse on Filbert Street was a building I had been inside twice before. Once in 2009, a contract dispute from the tail end of the real estate years that had taken 14 months to resolve and had cost me more in legal fees than the dispute was worth. Once in 2019, a workers' compensation matter that had been resolved in a single hearing. I knew the lobby, the security line, the particular smell of the place, institutional carpet and old paper, and the faint metallic undertone of the ventilation system. Marcus was waiting near the elevator bank. He was wearing a dark suit and carrying a briefcase that I knew contained a second copy of the 41-page document, a copy of the bank records, and a USB drive with the audio file. He shook Sarah's hand and then mine and said, "Judge Harlan's courtroom, 3rd floor. We have about 15 minutes." We took the elevator. Sarah stood between us, holding her folder, looking straight ahead at the elevator doors. The 3rd floor hallway was quiet, benches along one wall, a water fountain that made a sound like it was thinking about working. At the far end of the hall, outside the double doors of courtroom 3B, Richard was standing with a man I did not recognize, younger than Marcus, wearing a suit that was slightly too well fitted for a courthouse hallway, the kind of suit that announces itself. Thomas Greer, I would learn later. Richard had found him 3 weeks ago, after Marcus's initial filing had gone through, and Richard had understood that something was actually happening. Richard saw me. I watched his face from 40 feet away. He had his phone in his hand, and he lowered it slowly and looked at me, and then at Sarah, and then at Marcus, and then back at me. His attorney said something to him. Richard did not respond. He was still looking at me. I had not seen my son in person since the restaurant on Chestnut Street, the night he had said what he said in front of the waiter named James, who had been working that section for 6 years, and who had looked at his shoes afterward. Richard was 32 years old, and he was wearing a tie, and he looked, standing in that hallway, like a man who had just understood that the thing he thought was not going to happen was going to happen. I did not say anything to him. I did not nod. I looked at him for a moment, and then I looked at Marcus and said, "Are we ready?" Marcus said we were. We walked toward the courtroom doors. As we passed Richard, his attorney stepped forward slightly and said, "Mr. Webb, my client would like to request a brief continuance to review the supplemental filings." Marcus did not break stride. That request was denied last Thursday. Mr. Greer, Judge Harlan's order is in the record. Greer said something else. I did not hear it because we were already through the doors. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered from 2009. Judge Harlan was already on the bench, reviewing something in a folder. He was a man in his early 60s with reading glasses and the particular stillness of someone who had sat in the same chair and heard the same categories of human failure for long enough that very little surprised him anymore. I had appeared before him once, in the 2009 contract matter, and I remembered that he had asked 2 questions and then ruled without a pause, and that his questions had been exactly the right questions. The clerk called the case. Richard and Thomas Greer entered behind us and took their seats at the respondents' table. I sat next to Marcus. Sarah sat in the first row of the gallery, her folder open on her lap, her pen uncapped. Marcus set the 41-page document on the table. Judge Harlan looked up from his own papers and said, We're here on the matter of Webb on behalf of Callaway versus Callaway regarding the petition for recovery of misappropriated joint marital assets and the associated evidentiary record. He looked at Thomas Greer. Counselor, your continuance request was denied. Are you prepared to proceed? Greer said yes. Judge Harlan looked at Marcus. Mr. Webb, you've submitted a supplemental exhibit. Walk me through it. Marcus stood and said, Your Honor, the supplemental exhibit is a 41-page evidentiary document comprising bank transfer records, a handwriting analysis conducted by a certified examiner, and an audio recording of a telephone conversation between my client and the respondent, recorded in compliance with Pennsylvania law. The document establishes that on March 14th and September 22nd of 3 years ago, the respondent authorized the transfer of $50,000 from the joint account held by my client and his wife, Catherine Callaway, to a business account associated with Callaway Financial Group, LLC, of which the respondent is the sole director. The courtroom was quiet. Judge Harlan picked up the document. He put on his reading glasses. He turned to the bank records section. I could tell by the way the pages moved, the tabbed dividers Marcus had inserted. He read. He turned a page. He read again. Then he turned to the transcript section. He read it once. Then he read it again. 7 words, rendered in plain black type. He set the document down and looked at Richard over the rim of his glasses. The look lasted 4 seconds. I counted. Mr. Callaway, Judge Harlan said. His voice was the same as I remembered it, flat, precise, the voice of a man who chose his words because he meant them. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Richard's attorney put a hand on Richard's arm. Judge Harlan said, Do you understand what this document establishes? Richard said, Your Honor, I can explain the signature on that transfer form was authorized by my father. He gave me verbal authorization to manage the account while he was dealing with the diagnosis. Judge Harlan looked at him over the rim of his glasses. He did not speak. He turned to page 31 of the document and slid it toward the edge of the bench. Mr. Webb, page 31. Marcus stood. Your Honor, page 31 is the handwriting analysis conducted by certified forensic examiner Dr. Louise Faraday of the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Faraday examined the authorization signature on both transfer forms and concluded, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that the signature is not David Callaway's. The pen pressure, letter spacing, and baseline angle are consistent with the respondent's own handwriting samples, which are reproduced on page 33. Richard said, That analysis is wrong. I want to contest it. Judge Harlan said, You are welcome to retain your own examiner. That is not today's proceeding. He turned another page. Mr. Webb, the audio exhibit. Marcus said, Your Honor, the audio recording begins on page 22 of the transcript. The call took place on October 9th. My client recorded it as a party to the conversation in compliance with Pennsylvania's wiretapping statute, 18 P.C.S., paragraph 5704, subsection 4. Thomas Greer stood up. Your Honor, the recording was obtained under circumstances that... Judge Harlan said, Sit down, Mr. Greer. I've reviewed the statutory basis. The recording is admissible. He looked at Richard. Mr. Callaway, I'm going to read 7 words from this transcript. I want you to tell me whether you said them. He looked down at the page. He read, I don't care if you die. He set the document down. Did you say that to your father? Richard's mouth opened. Nothing came out for a moment. Then he said, I was under pressure. I didn't mean... Judge Harlan said, That wasn't the question. The room was very quiet. The ventilation system made it sound. Sarah did not move in the gallery behind me. I looked at my hands on the table, and then I looked at Judge Harlan, and I waited. The bait had been set for a long time. The trap had been built carefully, one document at a time, one phone call at a time, one recorded word at a time, over months of quiet work that Richard had known nothing about because Richard had decided a long time ago that I was not worth paying attention to. He was paying attention now. Judge Harlan set the document down. He took off his reading glasses and set them on top of the folder. He looked at Richard for a long moment without speaking, and in that silence, I heard the ventilation system, and I heard someone shift in the gallery behind me, and I heard Thomas Reeves, Richard's attorney, clear his throat very quietly. Then Judge Harlan put his glasses back on and read the document again. The second time took longer than the first. When he finished, he said, "Mr. Calloway, do you deny these allegations?" Richard said, I can explain." Judge Harlan said, "You can explain in court, but these documents are very clear." He set the folder to his left, which was the side where his clerk, a young woman named Anita, who had been in that room for every minute of the proceeding, was already making notations. What I have in front of me is a transfer record showing $50,000 moved from a joint family account into a private holding account registered to Calloway Financial Group. The transfer date is 11 months ago. The signature authorizing the transfer is David Calloway's. He paused. Mr. Marcus Webb has submitted a handwriting analysis from a certified forensic examiner. The signature is not David Calloway's. Thomas Reeves stood up. He said, "Your Honor, we need time to review these documents." Judge Harlan looked at him. "You have had time," he said. "My ruling is as follows. Mr. Richard Calloway must repay $50,000 to the family estate, plus interest calculated from the date of the transfer. Additionally, he is prohibited from accessing any family assets pending further legal proceedings, and I am referring this matter to the Pennsylvania State Bar for investigation into potential fraud." He looked at Thomas Reeves when he said the last part. Thomas Reeves sat back down. Richard's chair scraped against the floor. He said, "Your Honor." Judge Harlan said, "We are adjourned." Anita closed her notebook. The room began to move. Marcus Webb leaned toward me and said something I didn't hear because I was watching Richard stand up from his chair. His face had gone the color of old concrete. He looked at Thomas Reeves. Thomas Reeves was already putting papers into his briefcase and not looking back at him. Richard stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides, and I thought about the restaurant 6 months ago, the white tablecloth, the way he had said "dead weight" in a voice that was quiet and pleasant and completely certain. He had been very certain that morning. He was not certain now. I picked up my folder and followed Marcus toward the door. In the corridor outside the courtroom, the fluorescent lights were the same as they always are in that building flat and even and without warmth. Richard came out behind us. Catherine was standing near the wall by the water fountain. She had been in the gallery for the last 40 minutes, and I had known she was there without looking. She looked at Richard. Then she looked at me. She said, "David, I didn't know." I said, "Yes, you did." She opened her mouth and then closed it. She stood there with her purse held in both hands in front of her, and I could see her working through what to say next. The way she had always worked through what to say next when a conversation stopped going the way she expected. She didn't find anything. After a moment, she turned and walked toward the elevator at the end of the corridor. She pushed the button. She did not look back. The doors opened and she stepped inside. And that was the last time I saw her in that building. Richard was still in the corridor. He said, "Dad." I had not heard him use that word in a long time. He said it the way a man says a word he has forgotten how to use carefully, like he was testing whether it still worked. I turned and looked at him. His face had not recovered its color. His suit was the same good suit it had always been. Charcoal gray, the kind of suit that costs more than I make in 2 weeks on the forklift. He said, "Dad, I didn't mean I was trying to protect the family's assets. You were sick, and I didn't think." Marcus Webb was standing 6 feet away. Anita from the clerk's office had come into the corridor with the file and stopped when she heard Richard talking. I let him finish his sentence. Then I said, "You called me dead weight." He didn't answer. I said, "In a restaurant, in front of a waiter named James, who had been working that room for 4 years and who wrote down what he heard that morning and signed a statement, which is Exhibit 7 in the folder Judge Harlan just read." I paused. "You were not quiet about it." Richard looked at Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb looked at the wall. Then Richard's voice changed. It dropped lower, and the certainty went out of it, the way air goes out of something punctured. He said, "Dad," not the way he had said it in the restaurant, not the flat complaint of it, something else. "Dad, please, I can fix this. I have the money. I can wire it back today, this afternoon, before the close of business. You don't have to let it go to the bar. I have a company. I have people who work for me. If the fraud referral goes through—" Anita from the clerk's office was still in the corridor, 3 feet away, her file folder open. She had stopped moving when Richard started talking. Marcus Webb had not moved either. Richard said, "I made a mistake. I know I made a mistake. But you're my father. You don't have to do this to me." I looked at him for a moment. He was 32 years old, and he was wearing a good suit, and his face had gone the color of old concrete, and he was asking me not to let the consequence of a thing happen after the thing had already been done. I thought about the restaurant. I thought about the phone call from Dr. Ferris's waiting room. I thought about Sarah sleeping in a plastic chair at 5 in the morning and a Honda Civic sold for $2,000. I said, "I hope you're well, Richard." Then I walked back toward the elevator. Marcus caught up with me near the stairs. He said, "You won. Completely. He'll have to sell the company to cover the judgment. The interest alone is going to push the total past $60,000, and the fraud referral to the bar will freeze his operating accounts while the investigation runs. He's looking at criminal exposure on top of the civil ruling." He paused. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I've never seen a judge go that still before speaking." I said, "I just wanted the truth to come out." Marcus nodded once. He said he'd have the final transfer documents for the house ready by the end of the week. I thanked him and took the stairs down. Sarah was waiting in the lobby near the front doors. She had her coat folded over her arm, and she was watching the elevator numbers above the bank of doors. And when she saw me coming down the stairs, she crossed the lobby and put her arms around me. I held on to her for a moment. She smelled like the same shampoo she had used since she was in high school, something with cedar in it that I had always associated with her coming home. She said, "I'm proud of you, Dad." I said, "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. You did the right thing, and you're protected now. I've put the house in your name. No one can take it from you." She pulled back and looked at me. Her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "When did you do that?" I said, "Patricia Chen notarized the transfer 4 months ago, before the surgery, before any of this went to court." I looked at the lobby doors, the gray November light coming through the glass. I wanted to make sure that no matter what happened in that room today, you had something that was yours. She took my hand and held it, and we walked out through the doors together into the cold Philadelphia afternoon. 1 month later, Richard sold Callaway Financial Group. The sale closed at $8 million, $4 million below what the company had been worth before the fraud referral became public record, because buyers who know a seller is under investigation do not pay full price. Catherine's situation resolved separately. Marcus had filed a motion the week after the hearing, citing her recorded phone call to Richard, the one Carol Dempsey had heard through an open window, as evidence of knowing participation in the concealment of the transfers. The court agreed that her claim to the joint marital assets was materially compromised by that involvement. She retained her personal accounts. The joint holdings, including the equity in the Lansdowne property, were removed from her access pending the final settlement. She did not contest it. I think she understood by then that contesting it would require her to explain, on the record, why she had told our son that his father's cancer was manipulation and that he had a future to protect. Sarah called me the morning after she read the settlement summary. She said she had also called Catherine. She said the call had lasted 4 minutes and that she did not plan to make another one. She said it without anger, the way she said most things as a fact she had already decided was true. I did not tell her what to do. It was not my decision to make. The judgment and accrued interest consumed most of what remained after the sale costs. His attorney, Thomas Reeves, withdrew from the case 2 weeks before the sale closed. The Pennsylvania State Bar opened a formal inquiry. I did not follow the details closely. Marcus Webb sent me updates by email, and I read them at the kitchen table in the mornings before work, and then I put the phone down and made my coffee. I went back to the forklift. The yard at the Kensington warehouse runs 3 shifts, and I work the first. The other operators are men I have worked alongside for 3 years, men named Gerald and Tony, and a younger man named Darius who is saving to buy his mother a car. They did not know about the lawsuit, and I did not tell them. The work is the same work. It has always been load, move, set down, check. The machine does not care about $50,000 or state bar investigations or the price a company sold for. It cares about balance and weight and the position of the forks. I've always found that clarifying. My health insurance through the warehouse covered the follow-up scans. Dr. Ferris's office called in January with results that used words like stable and no new growth, and I wrote those words on the notepad I keep by the kitchen phone and looked at them for a while before I made dinner. Sarah still teaches 4th grade at the school on Girard Avenue. She does not worry about the mortgage now, because there is no mortgage, the house is hers, free of any claim, filed and recorded and witnessed by Patricia Chen, whose signature I trust because she has been doing this work for 31 years and does not make mistakes. Sarah comes for dinner on Thursday evenings. She brings whatever she has been cooking that week, sometimes a soup, sometimes something her students' parents taught her to make. We sit at the kitchen table and eat and talk about her classroom and the neighborhood, and sometimes about nothing in particular. Those evenings are the best part of my week. I saw Richard once, in March. I was driving back from the lumber yard on Frankfort Avenue, and I stopped at a light on Aramingo, and he was on the sidewalk outside a coffee shop, standing with his phone in his hand, looking at the screen. He was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize, not the charcoal suit, something older. He looked up when the light changed, and we were briefly in the same line of sight. He saw me. I could tell by the way his hand stopped moving over his phone screen. I looked back at the road and drove. There was nothing else to say to him. Not because I was angry, the anger had finished its work a long time ago. Somewhere between the 4th document I filed and the morning Marcus Webb called to tell me the forensic examiner had confirmed the signature. What I felt when I saw Richard on that sidewalk was not anger, and it was not satisfaction. It was closer to the feeling you get when you finish a job and put the tools away. The work is done. The weight is set down. You check the forks and you move on. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table after Sarah had gone home. The dishes were done. The kitchen smelled like the soup she had brought tomato, with something smoky in it that I hadn't been able to identify. Outside the window, the light was going, the way it goes in Philadelphia in March, slowly and then all at once, the sky turning from gray to a deeper gray before the streetlights come on. I could see the forklift keys on the hook by the door where I always hang them. Tomorrow was a first shift day. I would be at the yard by 6. Sarah had said something as she was putting on her coat to leave. She had stopped at the door and turned back and said, "You know, I used to think you were just patient. I didn't understand until this year that you were actually planning the whole time." I said, "I learned it from the land. When I lost everything in those deals, I watched the way the ground settled after the contamination was gone. It takes time, but it settles." She said, "So were you, Dad. You just took longer to show it." I heard her car start in the driveway and pull out onto the street. The sound faded. The kitchen was quiet. I sat there a while longer with my coffee warm this time, and then I got up and turned off the light. If you've ever sat in a quiet room after something long and difficult finally resolved itself, not with noise, not with celebration, just with the ordinary sound of a car pulling away and a light being turned off, you already understand what this story is really about. Not the documents, not the courtroom, the moment when the weight is set down and you realize you can sleep. If these stories find something true in you, I'll be here.